was still lacking in certain respects. He went quite easy on the emergency responses, and I think there has to be a collective responsibility here around the disaster which goes beyond the police and the role of the police on that day. However, the interim report was quite hopeful, and most people, certainly bereaved families, felt optimistic after the interim report. When the final Taylor report came out, it was far more generic in nature. What you had was a report essentially around ground safety. So what you had in the final report was suggestions by Lord Justice Taylor, which have since been taken up, around all-seater stadia and the issue of safety, obviously paramount in the minds of those who were at Hillsborough. But what it did clearly was set in history that in years to come, when people were looking at Hillsborough or looking at issues around football safety, they would look to the Taylor report and they would be drawn to the final report. And the interim report somehow gets lost in it all. No one can say that there's been no investigation into the disaster. There's been investigation after investigation. It's not that the facts aren't known. The facts are known. We had the Taylor inquiry. We had the inquests. We had the Stuart Smith scrutiny. We've had independent research conducted from the group I was involved with, the Hillsborough Project. We have had so many legal avenues pursued where the evidence has been given time after time. It was given to the appeal in the House, in the High Court for the judicial review. It's been presented to the Attorney General, several Attorney Generals, in fact, time after time, and yet to date, no one has been held accountable, legally accountable, for what occurred on that day.
Did anybody get sacked after Hillsborough? Oh, no. Did the guy who was running the game get sacked? No. He got pensioned off or moved into, an early pension. How does it work? I mean, for example, when Heysel happened, the chairman of the Belgian FA got 6 months. A 72-year-old guy, but he was at the top of the chain of responsibility, so he carried some responsibility. The chief of police was convicted. When some people may remember, a stand collapsed way down, I think it was in Corsica. It was a European Cup game, early 1990s. It was a temporary stand because it was a small club with a big fixture. They put up a temporary stand, it collapsed. There were a couple of dozen people killed. The secretary of the French FA went down. What happens here? Nothing. It was an FA Cup game, wasn't it? They're responsible for ticket distribution. Nothing. Police, nothing. Sheffield Football Club's their ground is nothing. So how does it work like this?
The longest inquest in British history, the 2 reports, an interim report on what happened on the day, and a full report on the state of British football and how it should be changed in order to redress. 40,000 witnesses and nobody charged with a criminal offence. More cameras. I mean, in them days, you didn't have CCTV, mobile phone cameras and stuff like that, but there's probably more cameras there than at any other event of the day. And yet, the crucial cameras, them that were trained from the police box on the pens and could show how it had been managed, went missing before the day was out.
The decision to cut the inquest off at 3:15 when, people were still alive who died after 3:15. The whole thing stank to high heaven. And the laws which govern inquests in this country, how evidence can be taken and so on, the whole thing just, it was just typical of the way in which the British legal system protects its own.
You have this appalling situation where all these inquiries, which have cost so much money, have served only to cover up the truth and to protect those responsible.
You know, it's not just about the police, there were other people responsible there. Sheffield Wednesday, in the way they managed their responsibility for the grounds, the engineers, who actually changed the layout of barriers, the City Council, who had a responsibility for the safety certificate, the Football Association and Graham Kelly, who'd had hundreds of complaints about the way that the match was managed the year before, exactly the same circumstances. You know, if the course of justice had followed the rightful cause and justice had have been done and been seen to be done, then the dock would have had to have been the size of a football pitch to accommodate those that should have been charged for their part in what went on that day.
Had people held their hand up after Hillsborough and said, we are responsible, and had people been held accountable, the families I've met and the survivors I've met are reasonable people. They would have accepted, by and large, and moved on with their lives. People say, why are they still around? They're still around because no justice has been meted out to their families. No justice has been meted out to the survivors who are still berated and condemned when all they did was save lives on that day.
And that is what we want, a recognition of the fact that a terrible tragedy occurred and that we were mistreated and misrepresented and lied about in the press. Justice for the 96, it's like a rally cry, and we've released that song because to actually try and hammer home the point that we still haven't had justice, and for the people that were responsible that day to stand up and be counted and admit responsibility to the families, because until that happens, you can never, you know, let it go off your chest.
96 lost souls, dead, blind and mute, while Mackenzie's in his counting house, counting all his loot. The tears have frozen in our people's eyes. 1,000 rivers could run dry. The time our enemy is wounding with its days. What I'm looking for is something I can't find no more. Some justice here today. Hear what I say now. Hear what I say now. Justice for the 96. Justice for the 96. Justice for the 96. Yeah. Justice for the 96. Justice for the 96. Justice for the 96. Justice for the 96. Yeah. Tears are frozen in our people's eyes.
Legally, there was nowhere else to go in this country. They'd well stitched us up. When the European Courts, the Human Rights Act, the right to life, which means, under Section 2, it's Kevin's right to life, and it's his right, because he died in the hands of the state, it's his right to a fair trial. And myself, as next of kin, have a right to see that Kevin got a fair trial, to determine how he died. Now, with the 3:15 cut-off point and the evidence that I've uncovered, how Kevin died has never been answered, and what he died from has never been answered.
The coroner was imposing that 3:15 cut-off. His argument was